ability to service its debt at any point in time. This is what we call intertemporal budget constraint. So be able with future budgetary surpluses to service your debt at any point in time. When we take a look at historical developments, we see that in the past, also in the Commission, the focus was mainly on the debt trajectory. So is the debt stabilizing at a certain point in time? And this was the criterion for solvency then. Nowadays, we take a broader approach, not just the Commission, but also the IMF, for example, or the European Stability Mechanism, the ESM, or the ECB. We all have a broader approach to fiscal sustainability, which has especially come to fruition after the crisis of 2008, 2009, but also the euro area debt crisis. So nowadays, we also consider liquidity risks or shorter-term risks, the plausibility of the required paths to reach a certain debt level, what are certain thresholds one should avoid, and also macro imbalances such as contingent liabilities, which could trigger financial crisis. So there's clearly a need for a comprehensive framework, and over the years this has come to fruition at the Commission. So I will often refer to the aging cost because over the years the fiscal sustainability framework has been developed hand in hand with the aging report at the Commission. So in 2001, the starting point, it was the publication date of the first aging report, and also the starting point for the fiscal sustainability analysis. So the Commission started to work on this point. Then in 2006, there was the introduction of what they call fiscal gap indicators, which at the time focused, as said, on the long term. So what is happening in the long term with the debt projections. So we have two what we call fiscal gap indicators because they measure what is required, what kind of budgetary effort is required to achieve a certain budgetary target. So we have what we call the S2 indicator and the S1 indicator. So the S2 indicator, it measures the fiscal effort to stabilize debt permanently regardless of the horizon, so over an infinite horizon. I will come back to the indicators more in detail later on in the presentation. And then we have also the S1 indicator, which measures the budgetary effort needed to reduce government debt to 60% in the long term. At the time in 2006, the long term was 2050 because this was the endpoint of the aging report projections. So there's a clear target. You have to not just level it, but you would have to reduce it to 60%. So then again, it measures this effort to arrive there. And 60%, of course, is the treaty reference value of government debt of 60% that was put in the European Treaty. Then, as mentioned, we had in 2008, 2009, but also later on, we had the euro area debt crisis. So we introduced a more multidimensional approach. So the short term and the medium term were introduced. So the short term, we have the S0 indicator, which then tries to detect fiscal stress early on. So it's really with a short-term horizon within the next year. This is done on the basis of a range of macro financial variables. So really looking at the liquidity risk, for example, what are the financing needs of a market, of a government? Does it need to seek recourse to the financial markets to a high degree in the coming years? So there's a higher exposure, of course, also to liquidity risks. So this is the short term. I will not dwell on that because it's a special horizon. On medium term, more important, the DSA tool was introduced. And DSA stands for Debt Sustainability Analysis. And what it is doing, also for the other indicators, I will get back to it later on, it makes debt projections over the medium term up to 10 years. And it sees, okay, what is happening there in terms of debt developments. And then important in the long term, so we had the S1 indicator initially for the long term, but the S1 indicator, it moved to the medium term, and the 60% target was then supposed to be reached within 15 years. And this also is in line with the operationalization of what they call the debt rule. So after the financial crisis, the member states agreed on stricter budgetary rules, and the 60% rule of the treaty was operationalized, so it had to be achieved on a shorter term horizon. So it was measuring then the effort over a period of 15 years instead of in the long term. And the DSA tool also instructed the long-term classification in that case. So this brings us to the current framework. Of course, some indicators, the calculation has changed a bit over the years, but since 2012, 15, it has been more or less stable in this way. So we have three time dimensions, and we have a risk classification for each time dimension, either low, medium, or high risk. So it's not a binary tool. It's not saying, okay, this is unsustainable, this is sustainable. It's more on a spectrum, let's say. In addition to this, okay, we have the risk classification for medium, short, medium, and long term. We also look at additional risk factors, such as what is the debt composition? Is it mostly short-term running, long-term running? Contingent liabilities as well, and the financing needs.
Hallo, het is momenteel geen geluid online. Ah, voilà, het is in orde.
So on this slide, you see the latest results, which are based on the Commission forecast. So it's always updated twice a year based on the autumn forecast and the spring forecast prepared by the Commission. So this is the update based on the spring forecast from last year. The update for the autumn forecast is forthcoming. So normally it will be published within a couple of weeks. So soon this will be outdated, but framework has quite a lot of stability between different vintages. So as said, you have low, medium, or high risks for the countries here on the map. So these are the final classifications for the medium term and the long term risks. But as said, so the medium term is the result of the DSA, the debt sustainability analysis tool, together with the S1. So together they determine what is the risk classification, and the long term risk is the result of the S2 and the DSA indicators. So together they determine it. So the starting point respectively is the DSA and the S2 indicator, and then depending on what is the result for the S1 and the DSA, the medium and long-term risk can be one notch worse. So for example, if you take a look at Greece, Spain, France for the long term, you see the S2 indicator indicates low risks, but the DSA, because of the high debt level in these countries, is at higher risk. So then the final risk classification is medium risk for these countries. So it can only worsen the initial signal from the DSA or the risks horizons. So to give more detail on the different indicators, so the DSA, the debt sustainability analysis, its main purpose is to look whether under different scenarios the debt remains or is brought on a sustainable path within 10 years. How is this done? It's done on the basis of two different kinds of debt projections. First, you have the deterministic projections, which means deterministic, you make certain assumptions on your government balance, on your growth, on your interest rate, inflation, these kind of things, and you run a projection, you run a simulation. So what is the departing point for the government balance? There we use a no fiscal policy change assumption. So the starting point is a Commission forecast, which runs until 2024 for the latest autumn forecast. And then we calculate on the basis of that what we call the structural primary balance. So the primary balance is without the interest payments, and then the structural primary balance, SPB, as I will call it afterwards as well. So this SPB, structural primary balance, it takes out the cyclical component of the government balance. So the economic cycle as well as temporary government measures, one-off measures. So we take this structural primary balance and we keep it unchanged for the next 10 years, but we adjust for the projected cost of aging. So if you know, okay, pension and healthcare expenditure are increasing year after year, we account for that, of course, in the projections. On top of that, so that's the baseline, we have several alternative scenarios to stress test that dynamics. So the assumptions made in the baseline, how responsive are they if we would change these assumptions. We look, for example, the historical SPB, so the historical structural primary balance. What has been the track record of a country? How far is it removed from this historical SPB? If you would assume a country performs in lines, goes back to the historical government surplus or deficit, what is the implication for the debt trajectory? And there are several other scenarios. For example, the adverse R minus G. So R minus G is the difference between the interest rate and the growth, which measures the snowball effect. So if you have a positive R minus G differential, this means that your interest is higher than your growth, so you have an upward snowball effect, as risks to be emerging in some countries at the moment because interest rates have risen a lot, of course, over the past year. But over the past 10 to 15 years, we've seen that the snowball effect has been downward for many countries. So on the basis of these scenarios, to summarize how it is then decided, we look at three factors. We look at the debt level after 10 years, so the endpoint, and 2033 it will be in the forthcoming updates. We look at the trajectory, so the peak, at which year is the debt expected to peak? Is it already short after the first year, or is it only at the end of the projections? So there's a higher risk then. And we also look at the fiscal consolidation space. So there again, we look at what is the historical performance, and is the country expect to have a deficit comparable to the whole historical performance? This means that there's little scope for further consolidation, or is there a big margin? So are they far removed from the historical performance? This means, okay, there's scope for consolidation probably from a historical point of view for this particular country. So these were the deterministic projections, so they run over 10 years, as said. Then we have second kind of projections, which we call stochastic projections. So this is more like a statistical tool, and they run only over 5 years. So I'm simplifying a bit because it's quite a complicated tool. What we do there, we run a multitude of shocks, so about 2,000 shocks. We run simultaneously on interest rate, growth, primary balance, exchange rate for some countries that are not in the area. And we see what is the impact based on country-specific historical data. So how responsive is a certain kind of country to changes in interest rates, for example. And we use this to estimate the probability that that will not stabilize after 5 years, and also to measure the size of the uncertainty surrounding the baseline trajectory. So it helps the baseline projections to interpret this. So together with the other debt projections, we then determine a risk classification, which then will be either low, medium, or high for the debt, for the DSA. So that's the first indicator, the DSA, which I said is a starting point for the medium-term risk classification, also gives extra information for the long term. The second, so the supplementary indicator for the medium term is the S1 indicator. So as I said before, but maybe if the sound was not yet on for everybody. So the S1 indicator, it measures the consolidation effort, the fiscal, the budgetary effort that is required to reduce debt to 60% of GDP in 15 years' time. So again, it reflects the improvement in the structural primary balance. This is always the point of reference, a structural primary balance, but okay, you can see the government balance as well. Over a period of 5 years. So it's not an immediate improvement. The improvement would be spread over 5 years. This is the assumption. I'll immediately jump to the latest. It's also from the spring forecast, if I'm not mistaken. So these were the results for the S1 indicator. As you see, you have high, medium, and low risk. And you see it can be split into 3 components. So the blue bar, this is what we call the initial budgetary position. So this is the effort that is needed to ensure that your debt stabilizes. Starting from the current position, current deficit in many countries, how much do you have to improve your government balance to make that stabilize? But on top of that, of course, we want that not to stabilize. We want it to fall back to 60%. This is the hypothesis. This is the assumption. So then you have the debt requirements. So the white bar in this graph, you see the additional effort that is required to bring that down. You see that it's higher. It's the highest for the high risk countries. Over the next 15 years, of course, because to bring down debt from an elevated level, of course, you need a higher effort. And then on top of that, you have the cost of aging, because you can stabilize your debt and bring it down to 60%, but we also assume the dynamics coming from the aging costs. It's not the most important component, as you can see in this graph, so it's a gray bar. But it aggravates the situation for certain countries, as you can see, Italy, Belgium, Slovenia, Portugal, already for these countries, aging costs are quite substantial over the next 15 years. So this is also supposed to be accounted for in this as one indicator. And then we have also sensitivity analysis surrounding the baseline. We run several alternative scenarios to illustrate the impact of different assumptions on the S1 indicator. Then the S2 indicator. So as mentioned before, the S2 indicator is a starting point for the long-term risk classification, and it measures it's a theoretical indicator. So it's always important to bear this in mind. It's not policy advice. It's always to assess what are the risks. So what it is doing, it measures the immediate and the permanent adjustment, budgetary adjustment, that is required to stabilize the debt to GDP ratio over the infinite horizon. So permanently, it goes beyond the long term. Certain assumptions are made there to extrapolate trends. But of course, the assumption for the S2 as a whole is that it's stabilizing. It does not impose any restriction. It can stabilize at any level. And this is also why in the framework, as shown before, so you see here the long-term risk classification is the S2 in addition with the DSA, because the DSA, of course, it accounts for the debt level. This is why we complement the S2 indicator with the DSA results. So again, as for the S1 indicator, we can split up the S2 overall value into different components. So we have the initial budgetary position again. So this, we want that to stabilize. So this measures the budgetary impact of having to stabilize the debt level, as said, at regardless what level. So we don't have a debt requirement here. We only want to stabilize. But there you see the cost of aging component is much higher because we look at the long term. Of course, over the long term, the aging costs are higher than on the medium term. And this then gives the total S2 indicator values. You see in the bottom graph, you see what is the cost of aging component, where is it coming from? Is it pensions? Is it other components such as healthcare, long-term care, or education? And then you have the overall risk classification, and then we work with thresholds. So if the efforts implied by the S2 indicator is below 2, between 0 and 2, it's medium risk. If it's above 6%, then it's a high risk. Belgium, for example, is among the highest countries. So, and then just to illustrate that we have these risk scenarios, as mentioned, also for the S1 indicator. So there we see, okay, what is the impact on the S2 indicator if you would assume worse or better performance? For example, scenario C, again, this is a historical SPB scenario. If you would assume, okay, the government balance, it goes to the historical performance, what is the impact on the S2 indicator? Now you see for Belgium, for example, but also for Italy, the S2 indicator would be about 4 percentage points lower than in the baseline. So it's a difference relative to the baseline, which you see here, where for Belgium it's about 7, I would say, from the graph, and it would be 3, and Belgium would be in medium risk, for example. And we have also certain specific scenarios coming from the aging report, for example, the non-demographic risk scenario, where we assume technological developments are ongoing, but this leads to more expensive treatments in healthcare. For example, what would be the impact on aging costs and also on the S2 indicator here. So lower productivity, of course, which is quite important in the long term, how does your productivity develop?
To be clear on the former graph, so the graph, this one is this one. Left below, see the historical SPB scenario. This means looking at the good record of Belgium in times pre-euro introduction, this lowers the risk. Is that the correct interpretation?
Yeah, it's really the long-term average budgetary balance where Belgium and other countries were achieving budgetary surpluses on balance. Yeah. So it assumes, okay, you refer to that long-term trend. What is the impact then on this indicator?
And so this 4% is diminishing the risk very clearly.
Yeah, yes, indeed. Yeah, same for Italy, Malta. Okay, it's always a theoretical approach. So, and it needs to be interpreted how realistic is this return to this kind of level.
Because this is very contingent. It depends on historical situations and particular introduction of the euro, and it's very.
But it gives an illustration of how capable a country is of achieving this kind of surpluses. So it already includes also the less favorable performance since the past 10, 15 years, let's say.
And what's the reference period for this historical scenario? What's the starting point?
Look it up. I think scroll that. I think mentioned here. Yeah, here see the past observations. I cannot. It's in the report. I can tell you, but it goes depending on the data availability. It goes back quite a long way. So also the good years are included there, not just the bad years. If you in the report, it's clearly mentioned. Jump back to where we were. So these were the three indicators then, S1, S2, and the DSA, which together help to determine the risk classifications. Then, of course, what is the link with the fiscal and economic surveillance of this fiscal sustainability indicators? On the one hand, you have the fiscal framework, so the SGP, the Stability and the Growth Pact, which has two arms, the corrective arm and the preventive arm. And for the excessive deficit procedure, so these are countries which exceed the 3% of GDP deficit or the 60% of debt threshold. These countries normally enter the corrective arm where you have an adjustment trajectory. And one of the elements that is taken into account when the Commission considers to open an excessive deficit procedure is the fiscal sustainability. How is a country performing in this regard? And then in the preventive arm, in which all countries are that are not in the corrective arm, the adjustment path towards the MTO, sorry, the medium-term objective is informed by the fiscal sustainability indicator. So the MTO is a structural primary balance again, towards which a country is expected to adjust. But these rules, as you know, have been suspended in recent years. And then for the European semester and the Recovery and Resilience Facility, there again, our indicators play a role. If you have read the country report for Belgium in recent years, you see also reference made to these indicators, and they also help to instruct the country-specific recommendations that we issue to certain countries. So in the first phase, we see, is there a fiscal sustainability risk in a certain country? And what is the source of it? Is it emerging just from the elevated debt level? Okay, then it's not related to pensions or healthcare, then it's not be a recommendation on pensions or healthcare. If pensions and healthcare are contributing to the risk, then could be a fiscal sustainability related pension, healthcare, or long-term care recommendation for these countries, which then have also been linked to the RRP reforms agreed with these countries in 2021. And then, of course, there's the economic governance review, which is ongoing. It's not the topic of today, so I will not dwell too much on that. Just to mention that in the Commission proposal, which would, according to this proposal, which is just on the table being negotiated with the member states, of course, there would be a country-specific net expenditure path. And the path of this expenditure recommendation would be based on the debts, so debt projections. This is where the Commission's DSA, which we showed before, so the debt projection next 10 years, where this comes in. So depending on the risk classification, if you have high, medium or low risk, so here it's substantial, moderate, low, but it's the same risk classifications, then your adjustments would be over 3, 4, or 7 years. I think countries is also doing at the same time reforms, and it would be extended to 7 years. So the DSA plays there. The S1 and the S2 indicator do not play in that one, so it's only based on the DSA, which is also why our framework could be revised, that the medium-term risk classification could be solely based again on the DSA, and then the S1 moves again to the long-term, as was the case until 2010. This links to the economic governance review, which I know there's a lot of interest in that, but it's not the topic I work on the most, so I'm not in the position to go deeper into it. And then, as mentioned, so all the aging costs that we use in indicators, they come from the aging report projection. So I'll give a bit more background on this. So important to note, the aging report, it's a joint report. It's not just a Commission report that it's often perceived. It's prepared together with the member states in the Economic Policy Council, the EPC, and then within a technical working group, the aging working group. For example, Belgium is represented in this group by the Federal Planning Bureau. It concerns long-term projections up to 2070 for all the EU member states, and the last report was published in spring 2 years ago. We're currently preparing the next report in 2024 and May 2024 probably. So we have baseline projections and also several alternative scenarios, some of which you've already seen before for the indicators. It's important to note, I think, that the report itself, the aging report, it does not express itself on whether or not a pension or a healthcare system is sustainable. As mentioned, it's a joint report by the member states. So it's important also from a Commission point of view that we agree on these projections so they have a common point of understanding. So this is the starting point, which then feeds into other work streams such as the European semester and the fiscal sustainability analysis. So you will not find in the aging reports any wording saying, oh, this is unsustainable. That, as mentioned, we try to approach it from a broader perspective, not looking at just like the social system, the pension system, or the healthcare system, but the departing point, how are the overall public finances being assessed. And then in the second phase, what are the contributors to these risks, if there are risks. So the aging report covers 4 spending categories: pensions, healthcare, long-term care, and education, which together, I think in 2019, which is a starting point for the last aging report, together they account for 24% of expenditure of GDP in terms of government expenditures. So clearly these go at the core of the government functioning. So this is just background how it works. Basically the expenditure items, healthcare, long-term care, education, these are based on Commission models, which we propose and then discuss with member states. For the pensions, it's a bit different because pensions are so varied. Of course, the system, it depends from country to country, how it is set up, the first pillar. So what is done there, the national authorities, national institutions like the Planning Bureau for Belgium, for example, they prepare the projections, which are then scrutinized by the Commission and by the other member states. From an in-depth peer review, during which we raise questions, we ask for revisions if some things are not inconsistent with the underlying assumptions on demographics, for example. And then at the end, we have the total aging cost projections. This is also why you will see that the projections from the aging report for Belgium, they will be more or less consistent with those from the Comité de Vieillissement, because both of them are prepared by the Planning Bureau, even though definitions might be a bit different and assumptions, especially for demographic, they come from another source, but normally they go in the same direction.
I ask a question. So this means not all type of social expenditure is taken into account here, because in the Belgium vergrijzingsrapport, there's also unemployment benefits and child benefits who reduce over time, taken into account. Does this mean these aren't taken into account in the aging report of the Commission?
Indeed, so now we have 4 items that are included. In the past, we also included unemployment, but because it's a bit like education, which of course is important, but the variation in education was quite limited. So this was not really contributing to the overall trend. So it was decided together with member states that we would remove unemployment from the projections, also to lighten a bit the exercise. It was mainly for practical reasons. And indeed, as mentioned, there's some slight differences with the definition used by the Comité de Vieillissement. And so, but for example, like the allowances that go to older people, to retirees, normally these kind of social allowances, this is included in pension protection. So we have a quite broad definition of pensions there, but child allowances, for example, no, this is nothing, a bit different, but the main chunk, I would say, okay, it's healthcare and pensions. Is the bulk of it.
Yeah, those influence it, but they raise the expected aging cost. But when we read the reports, we see that expectations are that unemployment allowances, total cost will reduce over time, which compensates just a little bit the total aging cost. But could this cause a bit an overestimation compared to the national analysis of the expected aging cost? I don't know the exact figures, but it could be around 0.3 GDP or something like that. The reducing effect of the reducing unemployment costs?
I don't think we could look back at previous reports, because until the aging report 2018 we included it, so we could compare there what was the exact impact. But as said, it's not that it was not out of ideology or something that was removed, was just because it did not contribute too much. And it was also based because employment assumption, of course, is on the very long term, it was going down for all the countries by quite a lot. So normally unemployment benefits indeed were also falling. But of course, still in these assumptions, we make projections, we still make assumptions on employment markets. So there's still the unemployment rate is going down for quite a lot of countries, which also plays in other higher employment. So this helps to finance, of course, you have high contributions to social security. It's still there implicitly, but not in the unemployment expenditure, I would say. So, of course, you have a growing imbalance between retirees and workers. So this line is the EU average, but you see the gray lines are all the EU member states, and you see that it's going up for all countries. So the old age dependency ratio, which is the relationship between the number of people above 65 and the number of people aged 20 to 64. We have different definitions, but we like to use this definition because that's normally your working age population. People aged 20 to 64 there can be working. Many people start later, of course, some start earlier, but this is like a decent definition in our view. And of course, you see how it is about to evolve. So it's your possible contributory base is shrinking. You have fewer people at the age of 2064, not just relative to the people above 65, but also in absolute numbers. I don't know the numbers by heart for Belgium, but I think Belgium is more or less at a tipping point that the working age population has started to shrink or will do so in the next few years. But at the same time, of course, you have a lot of outflows, bigger cohorts of people aged above 65. And this trend applies to most member states. Of course, you see also in this line at some point it will stabilize, but this we know is happening, will happen, because these are just the results of past demographic trends, of course. So yeah, the aging report was prepared. It's a 2021 aging report, but as said, it's a very big exercise. So now we're starting for next year. Okay. So the demographic projections for the 2021 aging report were published spring 2020, just at the start of the pandemic. So it could not be accounted for. Also the macroeconomic assumptions, it was based on the Commission's forecast, also from spring, so from May 2020. So it could account for a bit what would be the likely impact, but it was very hard to assess at the time. We had some risk scenarios to assess from it. Okay, assume like a lagged recovery, slow recovery. So it's more in the risk scenarios, but indeed the baseline it could not be accounted. But we hope to have this impact your direction in the next aging report. And of course, if you have a shrinking labor force, so fewer people that can be working, this also limits your potential growth, which then adds to the problem of financing your social security system. Fewer people that can be working and be contributing. Especially you see that potential growth will be driven by labor productivity, which remains very important, especially total factor productivity in that regard is very important. And then the change in labor input, so fewer hours being worked in total. This is, of course, the result of fewer shrinking labor force. Yeah. I don't know the precise discrepancy, but I think they use, because if we go technical, the total factor productivity growth, which is the main driver of labor productivity, there we assume for all the countries that converges to 1% per time, and in Belgium, the Comité Vieillissement is making the same assumption there. And also on capital accumulation, so the other component there, they also move to the same one. So maybe it could be coming from the change in labor input that their demographic projections are different. So the orange bar. So I don't think it's from productivity, but maybe the number of hours worked there, because there we use for all the countries to use Eurostat demographic projection because then we have a common source based on the same methodology, but then national exercises, they could use their own projections. And in the long term, of course, if you have a different assumption, fertility or migration, this could have a big impact on the. I assume it's from the hours worked, so the orange bar. So the aging report projections, they're at unchanged policy. So what we include is everything that is legislated. So I'm now talking about pensions, because I mainly work on pensions, and previous meeting we had was also the focus was on pensions. So you see what is the impact on the average exit age from the labor market, so the effective retirement age, not the legal one, but the effective one. And we include for all the countries that have, for example, a link to life expectancy or have legislated an increase in the legal retirement age. We introduce this in the projections. This is accounted for. Also this automatic mechanism, for example, the Netherlands, which have a link to life expectancy, we include this, of course, in the projection because it's that unchanged policy. And then you see this are and the pension specifically, the expenditure projections by 2070. And you see for Belgium, it's going from about 12% to 15%. And this 12%, okay, it depends again on the definition you use, because I said you use a quite broad definition, including the allowances for the older people as well. And you see in some countries, pension expenditure is expected to fall. And this increase, not just in Belgium, but also as you see in Italy, Luxembourg, Austria, Romania, Slovakia. Romania is a special case because this was because of indexation 2019. That the increase is concentrated in the next few decades. If you take a look for the EU as a whole, normally you have a peak by 2045 when average the boomers have retired, baby boom generation has retired, and afterwards you even have a decrease on average in the EU. And for Belgium, you have a stabilization by about 2045 in these projections. Maybe important to note the aging report figures. And this could be a source of a difference with the Comité de Vieillissement. So these were prepared. The exercise internally was done at the end of 2020, which was just too early to account also for the government measures that were agreed at the end of 2020, I think, but then legislated only a couple of months later during the government coalition agreement. So these measures are not accounted for yet in our figures because we only update them every 3 years. And also the measures from last summer are not yet accounted for. So this will be in next year. Yeah.
Little surprise with France, because surprised to see the figures with the debate in France, because the figures are relatively positive.
Yeah.
Not the debate in France with a problem of to finance pensions, no?
I think, yeah, but this is only expenditure side, of course. When you take into account contributions, which they do, they look at the internal balance of the pensions. The internal discussion in France, it's always about the balance of the pension system. I think there they have a problem on the contribution side, maybe. But indeed, okay, for France, as you all can see from the sustainability indicators I showed before, we do not single out pensions as a major problem. For France, the sustainability problems are coming more to the debt level. And there's a problem. Of course, France has, 42 schemes. So there's probably a problem of efficiency within the first pillar, which could be, some gains could be made without any doubt. Okay, sorry. But you see here, maybe this is also interesting that point of view. So we can decompose, break down the overall change in pension expenditure into more telling indicators. So this blue bar, the starting point, is the dependency ratio. As said, this is purely demographic factors. You can see it's by its own, it increases pension expenditure in all the countries to a varying degree, because of course demographics differ, but you see that all countries are aging, and this leads to higher pension expenditure. Then you have the coverage ratio. So this relates the number of pensioners to the population above 65. And then you can see that this by itself, it brings down the expected change in pension expenditure for most countries. There are some exceptions. And this is the consequence of measures by authorities to prolong careers, to extend working time, for example, by an increase in the legal retirement age. It will be more in countries like Italy, for example, Denmark, because they have a link to life expectancy in the legal retirement age, which then trickles through in the ratio. So this helps to reduce, to absorb the expected increase in aging costs in pension expenditure. And then you have the benefit ratio. So the benefit ratio is the relationship between the average pension income, pension benefits, and the average wage. So how does the average pension develops relative to the average wage? And there again, you see that this has a dampening impact on the overall pension expenditure. So because pension benefits are at current legislation, at current policy, are not expected to move in line with the average wage growth. You see that relative to the economy, to your GDP, pension expenditure would fall. So this helps them to offset as well for the demographic factor. Then you have the labor market effect. As said, certain countries, as you can see, Greece, Portugal, Spain, Italy, at the current juncture, especially this was in 2019, they had quite elevated unemployment ratios, which, because it's a long-term exercise, this is not realistic to assume, okay, they will only come down a bit. So in the long term, we assume that unemployment rates come down by quite a lot. And then you can see for these kind of countries, of course, this helps to finance the aging costs, to reduce the pension expenditure over time. They have more people working. See what coming.
Why you are not using the same overlap for population and our work?
Same, sorry?
Overlap, it's 2064, and for the hour, it's 2074.
Because this is, as you will see in the other formulas, 25, 27, it's because of this 2074. Okay. So it's also, I can give the link to the report. We have all the formulas, and then it levels out. So labor market effect, which is important for a limited number of countries with high unemployment rates at the moment. And there's a residual interaction effect, and then you have the total change projected for 2019 by 2070.
Like with the difference between France and Belgium, because I see that the contribution of the benefit ratio is very limited to Belgium, but in France is very high.
Yeah.
How can we explain the difference?
So the benefit ratio, you have two factors at play there, broadly speaking. So you have the replacement rate. So what is your first pension benefit you're getting? Is it relatively high compared to your last wage? And then afterwards, once you're in retirement, what is the indexation factor? And I don't know the replacement rates by heart in Belgium and France, but okay, Belgium has price indexation plus welfare adjustment for general scheme. France has just price indexation. So over the long term, this plays, of course, if you're just adjusting by price growth, and then you lose out. You will see other countries where this is more limited. I don't know them by heart, but presumably they have wage growth adjustment. Then pension benefits are adjusted or closer or an average or something. They move in line with wage growth, which is then in the long term assumed to be productivity growth as well.
Numerator, and then the other one, it must be the average salary, or
yeah, sorry, it's because of the breakdown, but it's indeed it's more like the explanation that average wage, indeed that's the average salary. So but indeed, if you're the GDP, you divide by the hours worked, then you have the average salary.
okay.
So and because of this benefit ratio is so important, put it here again. So the benefit ratio, it's simply how does your pension benefits evolve relative to your average wage. And as shown for most countries, this brings down pension expenditure on average. For certain countries, at the top, you see it's relatively, comparatively high, maybe compared to other countries at the moment. So they could be more easily absorb a decrease probably. But for other countries, which you see already are now at the bottom, the Baltic member states, Romania, Hungary, Croatia, it's already quite low, very low, and what we call adequacy. So how adequate is your pension income to replace your income once in retirement? And you see that for these kind of countries, it's starting from a low level and it will fall according at current levels. So this also indicates, of course, a risk that current current policies. In some countries, at some moment, probably government will have to step in to safeguard adequacy at some level. Of course, this is for the countries with a low starting point, but you also have countries with a high starting point, but with a very sharp decrease. So for these countries as well, even though it might remain close to the EU average, at some point, of course, people are comparing the past, there might be higher pressure to step in and adjust for this. So this is the risk scenario, which we also mentioned in the report. Important maybe to mention here, okay, this is for pillar 1, so the public scheme. For some countries, the second pillar and the third pillar, especially the third pillar, is becoming more important, is maturing, so this could compensate, not fully, but for some countries it will compensate fully if it's really mature, if it's widespread, high coverage. For other countries, it will help to some extent to offset this trend. So of course, for the adequacy as a whole, you have to look at all the pillars, all the schemes. Because the aging report, its main focus is on fiscal sustainability, we look at the first scheme. Of course, the adequacy angle is broader, and this is the scope of what we call the adequacy report, which is also a joint report by Commission and Member States prepared by the colleagues from DG Ample. And they have a broader approach, of course, to adequacy from different angles, different indicators. So it gives a better picture what is the total impact on adequacy. So as mentioned, we do a very long-term exercise. It runs up until 2017 now. So there's a very high sensitivity to your underlying assumptions. Demographics, so here already you could see if you have a bit lower fertility than assumed over the long term, pension expenditure would be almost 2 percentage points higher for Belgium, but also for many other countries. The demographic factors play strongly there because you have this compound effect, of course, time. And then you have several other scenarios, also positive scenarios like a higher employment rate for older workers, for example, goes in the opposite direction. So normally what we look at mainly are the underlying assumptions, but we also have a couple of policy scenarios to see, okay, what is the impact of policy changes? For example, if we were to assume that people were all retiring at current ages, so the effective retirement age would be unchanged, so there's no impact of adopted legislation, then you would see that for countries as Denmark, Cyprus, Finland, these have links to life expectancy, then of course the pension expenditure would be much higher because people would not retire much later as assumed in the legislation. And then we have with the opposite, what is the impact of a link to life expectancy? So this is for the countries that currently do not have a link to life expectancy, and then you see that it would reduce pension expenditure substantially in many cases. Just to wrap up, so of course, as mentioned, I focused on pensions, but all the aging costs in the indicators, S1, S2, the DSA, we always look at total cost of aging, which is summarized here in this graph. So it's not just pensions, also healthcare, long-term care, education, but for many countries, when total aging costs are high, it's often coming from the pension costs. But at the same time, healthcare, long-term care, these are assumed to increase for all the member states, purely age-related. And then education, it's falling in most member states, but to a limited extent. And unemployment at the time was even less, I think, the impact. And then specifically for Belgium, you see it's often referred to as something from the future. Populations are aging. At some point, this will have a fiscal impact. But if you take a look at how the structural primary balance has evolved over time, over the past 15 years in Belgium, you see that the deterioration, the substantial deterioration of the structural deficit, that this comes, but more than half, I think, based on this graph, comes from the steady increase in pension expenditure. At the same time, you see for the period 2013-16, 16-19, that there was relatively neutral, a change in pension expenditure, because at the time, of course, government reforms were adopted. Just some links to the most recent reports. So the fiscal sustainability report has the latest indicators, but as mentioned, in a couple of weeks, normally we should publish the debt sustainability monitor based on the most recent economic forecast. There are also links to the Commission's, to the aging reports, 2021.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Some of the questions here in the room are maybe on the net.
You have, if you overall aging costs over a long time, up to 5.4%. That's a little bit more pessimistic than the Belgian aging. Because for Belgium, we have a top in on 2045, actually, and then a little decline even.
I think
there's no big difference, but I thought it was a little bit more.
it could be. I'm not following Belgium specifically. I follow many countries, but as mentioned, of course, you have different assumptions, you have slightly different definitions, and the ones the Comité de Vieillissement are updated every summer. We only do it every 3 years. There might be some discrepancies. Of course, what we know, as mentioned, the latest ultimate government measures since 2020 are not included yet in our figures, these figures. So that will be an impact on that. Also, demographics might be moving in different directions. If you already have an impact, refugees from Ukraine, for example, this already changes your demographic baseline. So there might be a difference. I think for Belgium, in our baseline from 2021, I think the need stabilizing towards 2040. And I think now the peak is a bit later because of the latest measures taken. So indeed, the profile is a bit different, but I think the overall change is comparable. Of course, you work on the long term, so there's always a risk, a margin of appreciation and a narrow margin around goes in the same direction from the top.
Thank you for this explanation. You focus on the pension, but in Belgium we saw that the long-term care effect. Can you tell us a bit key factors?
I would very much like to, but as mentioned, we specialize as everywhere. I work on pensions, so I don't know the exact drivers of Belgium. I could not enlighten you on that. Of course, in the aging report, this is discussed at length, and you have done the breakdown, as I did for pensions. You have it also there available, but it's available. I can send it to you, but I cannot tell you from the top of my head. Sorry.
No, I don't have a question because I missed part of the beginning, but I suppose that all the slides will be made available. But
yes, I can reply on that.
No, and thank you very much, because I think it's very interesting material where also in the Commission of Finance and Budget in Belgium, we will take care of taking these conclusions with us. Thank you.
Perhaps can we also say that the presentation will be on the site after the presentation now, after the meeting now.
Another question? No question?
If I may, I'm just wondering that because there's a lot of costs that will come from the climate transition, both to deal with the effects as to invest in preventing climate change, etc. To what degree does the sustainability analysis take these into account?
I'll put back maybe the presentation because it's something indeed as it's not in this presentation, but we have included in the latest there. So in the latest fiscal sustainability reports, which you can find back on the website and on this link, so the first link, there we have started working on climate change and the fiscal impact of it indeed. So it's more based on it's not yet in the framework as a whole, as aging costs, they're fully included there. Climate costs, because it's a newer work stream as well, are not yet there, but we are developing this. We did some scenarios already, which we discussed there in the fiscal sustainability report as a chapter or section on climate change there as well. So indeed, something that we are aware of. Also, we know the other institutions, the ECB, the ESM, IMF, they're all working on this. So there's quite a lot of interaction on this to develop this work stream.
Just one more question on the is one indicator as the fiscal rules will be changed forthcoming. I can imagine the S1 indicator will be adapted to the new rules, which could be difficult because we will have country-specific medium-term debt levels, one can say, some sense, because we know the 60% it won't be changed, but in practice, it won't have such a direct, for some countries, disruptive effect as before. So you can't say a lot about what will be, but are you are you and your colleagues aware and considering a change of this one?
Yeah, so it's all under negotiations, of course. It's only a Commission proposal now, so it's up to the member states. But as we mentioned it somewhere in the box in the report last year, if in future these rules be adopted, that the DSA would be the sole instrument to instruct the fiscal adjustment trajectory, then the S1 indicator, as it was until 2012, could go back to the long term. This was its initial purpose, to give extra information to the S2 indicator, and then it could be again like the 60% reaches in the long term, which was its initial purpose, but then with that rule it was moved to the medium term. So this is something indeed we have in the back of our mind, that it would make sense because it's not used for the SGP rule, so it's no longer needed there, so to speak. And then the adjustment to the 6% comes over the longer term. Yeah, in our view, it would also make sense, contingent on what happens in the member state.
For connecting people, it's possible now to ask directly question about the presentation. Thank you very much, and see you next time. Thank you. Maybe for the new report, the new framework.
I'll send some colleagues for it.
In April or in May, or?
I don't know the exact time. I know it's being discussed now in the committees. Maybe yesterday, maybe today, but it's ongoing.
A different with the report of Comité d'études vieillissement is not the fact that the federal plan bureau take into account the effect of COVID in the last report.
Yeah.
And thus there is a reduction of the impact of aging.
It could be. It's for several countries goes.
Yeah.
It could be, but there were always differences in the demographic assumption between Eurostat and the national authorities. So, as said, we use it from Eurostat. It's prepared independently by Eurostat, so that in order that there's not discussion constantly. Okay, but these assumptions, it's something we know there's uncertainty. We try to address this in the scenarios that a higher, lower migration, for example. There will be always discussion, especially for smaller countries. The migration assumptions have a big impact, of course, on the long-term trajectory. Something we're aware of, but try to stay neutral and just use the Eurostat projections in order to the independent source for that. But indeed, as said, we prepared our 2020 aging report. It was amidst the pandemic breakdown, so there was a lot of uncertainty we could not accommodate for. We cannot easily postpone by 1 year because it involves a lot of work by many parties. But indeed, we will have an update within more or less a year. Our demographic assumptions will be published by Eurostat in spring, at the end of March. So you have an indication, discrepancy or not, between national assumptions and ours. 2024. So now we're doing the first part on all the assumptions, productivity, these kind of things. And this first effective report exists out of 2 volumes. So the first volume is with all the underlying assumptions, demographic, productivity, growth, and that we publish normally in November. And then on the basis of that, where the work starts then with actual projections, which is what most people look at. And that is then published in April, May. And then normally afterwards, then there will be a new fiscal sustainability report, because then, of course, I also said the framework is quite stable, especially in terms of aging costs, because we only change it, we only update it every 3 years. Unless if there's a big systemic reform and the member states ask to have like a peer review, then we update it at all. Because in the past, this had more repercussions, was more importance when you still had the MTO, the medium-term objective, was also updated in function of that. I think Belgium had an update of the aging cost 15 reform. Did not wait for the 2018 aging report, it was in 2016, I think. Because then you saw, of course,